Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the Conservation Podcast. The show dedicated to exploring and amplifying the world's underappreciated conservation stories. The stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and today I am joined by the absolutely fabulous Dr. Lucy Kemp, Project Manager for the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project and Chair of the IUCN Hornbill Specialist Group, to talk about, you guessed it, hornbills. It wasn't a tough guess, but well done if you did. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Southern Ground Hornbill, an incredibly clever and charismatic member of the family who's black and white with an incredible red, bright red face. They're just beautiful, wonderful, incredible animals, and I'm so excited to talk all about them. We chat all about what they are, how Lucy became interested in them, how they are impacted by human and elephant behaviours, and their important cultural role. So there's a lot to cover, especially because on top of all that, we talk about how the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project is working to protect them, and how the lessons they've learned can potentially be used to inform the study of Northern Ground Hornbills as well. So it's really interesting, and yes, I came into this with a love of hornbills already, and that love has only increased. It's fabulous, and I'm so excited for you to get to learn all about them. So I guess without further ado, I'll not keep the hornbills from you any longer. Let's get started. And welcome back to the show. I'm now joined by Dr. Lucy Kemp, Project Manager for the Mabula Ground Hornbill Project and Co-Chair of the IUCN Hornbill Specialist Group. And of course, we're going to be talking all about the wonderful world of hornbills. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lucy.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jack. I'm excited to be here. I'm a tad nervous, but I'll do my best.
There's no need to be nervous. It's just think of it as a phone call or a Zoom call. You can completely
Sure.
forget anybody's going to listen to it, and
All right.
and that makes it. That's what I do to make it way easier for myself.
All right.
Um,
Great.
but yes, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk because yes, I feel like the hornbill is something that I have this. I don't know. Every time I see them, I just think they are wonderful, gorgeous, interesting birds, and I'm sure we can talk a little bit about that and what makes them special. But before we do that, I always like to ask the guest to introduce themselves to the listeners, because I feel like I give the very kind of like branded, you're the project manager for this or the co-chair of that. But what should the listeners know maybe about you to get us started? Is there anything you'd like to tell them?
I guess that, I mean, some people say I've been fated to be here. I think just circumstance. But my parents did all of the early research on the Southern Ground Hornbill in Kruger
Mm-hmm.
National Park starting in 1966. So the very basic biology kind of stuff they did. My dad left my mom in a Land Rover at a nest for 5 days at a time to do observations. And so I guess they've been a part of my life since forever. I tried my very best to have nothing to do with them. I studied marine biology. I worked on black rhino, high value plant species as an alternative to ecotourism. I really tried not to work on birds, not to work on hornbills, and specifically not to work on the Southern Ground Hornbill. But here I am, 12 years on. And yeah, I just realized that with all of my experience in a various other very different conservation arenas, that I had a random skill set that I might be able to apply to these guys. And so I didn't plan it. I certainly didn't choose it, and here I am.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that, of kind of like when your parents do. I feel like sometimes people, like whatever your parents do, people like to rebel a little bit and do the opposite, or like try and do something like a bit different from what they did. So I was going to ask, like, how did you? Was it something that like they inspired you? I guess to want to be in and like do nature conservation work, and then you just like through circumstances they managed to pull you back in. How did they end up getting you back into the world of birds?
So when I finished school, I went to the UK. I worked in a pub. I did as much as I could to show myself that there was more to life than this.
Hmm.
But I realized that the wild had bitten my heart, and I realized that that had become a very important part of me, needing to have these huge wild open spaces and everything that lived within that. And I suppose that kind of led to my study of zoology and conservation. And even though I tried not to do this in particular,
Hmm.
somehow working towards keeping things safe, giving us places and things
Hmm.
to reconnect with, to refuel ourselves, I guess, became my driving force. And I guess the Ground Hornbill thing happened by chance, by fate, depending on who you talk to. But I'm glad to be here because I feel they're an amazing test case for a bunch of conservation ideologies that I firmly believe in, like really strong science-based conservation, really ensuring that communities are a vital part of conservation. And so I think they're an amazing vehicle to develop conservation in general, but obviously also to keep them safe.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that's really interesting actually. And I think we'll get into like all of the different ways in which we kind of you do practice kind of conservation with them and all of the kind of threats and different things that they face. But before we do, I suppose we should probably introduce them a bit more formally as well, because we kind of have introduced you now and how you got involved with them, but some people out there, I guess, might not even have any conception of this bird that we're talking about. And so I wondered, could you tell us a little bit about the ground hornbill and yeah, what is it for the uninitiated?
Okay, I'll do my best. So ground hornbills are kind of the primitive original hornbill. There's only two
Mhm.
species, the northern and the southern ground hornbill, one south of the equator, one north of the equator. And they're the only hornbills that don't seal their nest. So all the other species that kind of evolved after that, the female is sealed into the nest by the male. She loses her feathers. She's stuck in the nest until her chicks fledge. Whereas ground hornbills kind of predated that. And in a way, they are so prehistoric. They look like velociraptors. They behave like a cross between velociraptors and primates. They're incredibly primate in their behaviors. So they are a big black bird with an enormous, very powerful striking bill. But they can also use that bill with infinite delicateness. They can pick out flying ants from the air, or they can kill a highly venomous snake. So they've got this amazing dagger, I guess, attached to the front of their face. They then have these incredibly long eyelashes. All the hornbills have them, but somehow the ground hornbills look better in them. And they developed as kind of a sunshade to protect their eyes. They are
Mhm.
excellent hunters, and obviously, if you're hunting out in the savannas, you have to protect your eyes. If you lose your eyes, you're going to be a useless hunter. So these
Mhm.
enormously long eyelashes that I think any supermodel would die for protect the hunting eyes. Not just from the sun, but also they're walking through grass and shrubbery, and they really have to protect those. So they've got these enormous lashes. The males have a huge red throat pouch, which helps them
Mhm.
lose heat on the hottest days, but it also helps them get their call out. Which their call can travel up to 5 kilometers on a cold morning, so it's kind of like a boom box,
Mhm.
used for for advertising and also used for cooling. And then those black feathers with white primaries. So they look a bit dull on the ground and they do spend most of their day walking. But as soon as they take to flight, they've got 10 white primary feathers. And it's like this flash of white,
Mhm.
probably to give predators a bit of a fright. But I do think they look more beautiful in flight than they do on the ground.
Yes, yes. And now, like before we started, you called me out for saying I was the first person who'd ever described them as pretty, but you've just described them as beautiful. And so I think that's one step up even from
there's
from pretty.
there's a large audience who don't find them attractive. They kind of pay me to think they look nice. Certainly, the youngsters are hideous. Only the hand wearers that we work with think they're beautiful. As soon as they fledge, I can then connect. But they're
Mhm.
interesting looking, and they're just generally interesting. They're biologically interesting. They're culturally interesting, and they're not that bad on the eye, I guess.
No, no, and it's interesting actually to hear you describe them almost like I think did you say like primate like in some of their behaviors? Because I feel like I've noticed that whenever I've been lucky enough to encounter one. I've not ever seen one in the wild, but when I've seen them in various zoos or whatever it is, they are filled with kind of like this personal, they seem very filled with personality, in terms of like they seem very kind of like switched on, they seem very aware of what's going on, and they have this kind of like, they seem to be very quirky individuals. Would you say that they are like quite in, what do you mean by primate like, I guess, like are they very intelligent, is that kind of the gist of it?
So definitely intelligent. We've run sort of the
Hmm.
basic cognitive experiments, and they're up there with the smartest crows and
Hmm.
parrots. So they are super smart, but they do things like play. There's lifetime bonds between individuals. Even the adults are involved in play. So normally in birds, maybe the youngsters will fool around as they're learning some life skills. But ground hornbills, when they finished cruising through the savannas, killing whatever they can, if their tummies are full at the end of the day, there's time to play, there's time to bond. And they do. They spend, even the youngsters, I mean, sorry, even the adults get involved in rough and tumble, pulling tug of war on sticks. And, that's a really primate thing. It's quite unusual in birds. There's a lot of the lifetime bonds. There's a lot of learning. The youngsters really need those older birds in the group to teach them their bush skills, and so there's a lot of transference of knowledge. Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's like watching a troop of baboons, but prettier and more interesting.
Yes, yeah, I think that's fair. That's actually, yeah, I can see that. That's, and I feel like that's something we can all learn as we get older as well. We tend to lose the part of us where we're like, oh, we want to have fun and play in the like and do things in the evening. We want to just like relax and not do do anything. I feel like, yeah, it's something for all of us to aspire to be, is that once we're full of food at the end of the day, go out and just have some fun rather than relax.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Oh, but no, I that's so fascinating, and I guess something else that you mentioned was that they are kind of like culturally and environmentally kind of significant there, and it's, you've led me on perfectly to it. You preempted another question that I was going to ask you about, because yes, they're
Mhm.
kind of birds, I guess, are known for being these kind of like playing important environmental roles in terms of maybe seed dispensing for certain species, or kind of, yeah, kind of pest, if you can classify certain things as pest control for others, like dependent on the species. So I wonder what the role, like the important, if we do environmental role first and then we could come on to the cultural after, but like what is the environmental role that the ground hornbill plays?
So I think that they're top order predators. So they hold that really pinnacle sort of part of the food chain. What will happen if we remove them? I don't know. I would
Hmm.
I, I would hope nothing, but equally I'm doing my absolute damnedest to make sure that we don't do that, that we don't lose them. Every time you remove a top order predator from a system, things generally fall down. So
Hmm.
that's the one reason to keep them. But I do think, certainly within the South African context, but even further in the range, it's the cultural importance. They are so deeply important to people who've lived with them for millennia. And they are deeply entrenched and rooted in myth and lore,
Hmm.
in almost every area that they occur. And I almost
Hmm.
feel that maybe there's some other species that could fulfill the ecological role, but there's nothing that could fulfill that cultural importance.
Hmm. That's that's really interesting, actually. I wondered, could you tell us like a little bit more about that? I guess like what are the kind of what is the significance of this bird culturally? Yeah.
So generally, and it is generally, but across the range, the bird is strongly associated with the coming of the first rain. So they're known as the
Hmm.
rainbird or the thunderbird. In times of drought, you need them to call the rains. In times of
Hmm.
floods, you want them to chill a little bit on their flood skills. And so, that bringing of the rain, because if you're a subsistence farmer, without the rain, there's no crops. Without crops, there's no food or cash income, and without that, your family and community struggles. So they kind of associated in a really positive way with good rains, because they generally only lay eggs if it's going to be a good season. So I guess people have kind of looked at that over the eons, and kind of timed the planting of crops in some areas to when the ground hornbills are calling near the nest, because they will only lay if it's going to be a good season. And that, sort of cross between indigenous knowledge and biology is really interesting. And so
Mm.
that's kind of one of the most important things. I think also because they're a big, scary, big black bird, there's some negative and more fear connotations. If a ground hornbill lands on your house, maybe it means that someone is going to die in some areas. But what it does from a conservation point of view, it just means you're going to chase them away. So please don't land
Mm.
on my roof, go somewhere else. And so it doesn't, there are very few of the cultural, the sort of negative cultural implications that have a negative conservation implication. There's a little offtake for traditional medicine and ritual, but generally only in times of drought. And
Mm.
without that cultural importance, I think they would have been lost from much bigger areas within their range. So that cultural importance, I think, is what is keeping them alive and safe in quite large chunks of their range.
That's actually really interesting because it's interesting sometimes to hear about kind of the when they do have this negative maybe picture around them for certain aspects of their kind of their called their stories and the things that are associated with them. You would expect that, oh, this must be like quite a negative impact on them, if people might be scared of them, or they might hunt them, or they might kind of try and get rid of them actively. But it's interesting to hear actually that in fact that's a kind of bubble that protects them almost of the significance. And equally interesting to me, I think, is that aspect that the what was it you were talking about? Oh yes, the overlap between the biology and the kind of cultural stories and kind of myths and things that go around these animals, how those things work together, and how that kind of knowledge existed about the kind of biology and the breeding habits of the animal before probably it was studied by scientists. It was just not class in the kind of Western science canon view of what it can be considered science. That knowledge was already there, and that was already like people would be able to tell you, oh, they only lay eggs. So it's really interesting to hear this species as kind of a good example of where that kind of proves or shows or demonstrates that indigenous knowledge and kind of these things is just as valuable and just as valid as perhaps a more westernized view of science. That's really, really interesting to me. Really, really interesting. Um,
Absolutely. I feel when we do a lot of community engagement, and I find that I learn more than I'm able to share from any of those interactions. But also
mhm,
generally, these birds live up to 70 years old. So if you're an elder in a village, there's a good chance that the resident group of ground hornbills, that the current alpha male was a chick when you were a young boy, and you've both
mhm,
shared the same landscape. You've seen each other over decades. You've seen each other grow up in some sense. And so I find that when we do work with communities, the only thing I can really do is help them put their resident groups into sort of a national or a range-wide context. So the
mhm,
families that you've grown up with kind of belong to you. Unless you're going to take care of them, no one is, because of the territoriality. And so we really urge custodianship and pride in the families that you share the landscape with. And we're finding that's working really well. In terms of
mhm,
biology and things, there's very little that I can share with people who've grown up with these birds. They know them. They've spent decades with them, and not even just in general, usually with the same family group because of that territoriality.
mhm, mhm. That's really, really interesting. Actually, really, really interesting. And like, yeah, I wondered just to kind of paint, I guess, a clearer picture for me, like as well as the listeners. I because when you see birds like hornbills, these kind of larger bird species, you don't necessarily, I guess, picture them all the time as being like flocking birds. Like, how many in a group would you tend to find in an area? What's that kind of like group size and that sort of dynamic, the social dynamic there?
All right, so these guys are cooperative breeders. So there's an alpha pair, mum and dad, who do all of the breeding. And generally, the rest of the group, and that can be up to a group of 9 or 10 birds, generally, all of the other birds are helpers, and they generally males. The young females get kicked out of the group before they're even a year old. So they have to hack it on their own. They've got to head out into the wilds, they've got to escape predation, they've got to feed themselves, stay smart, stay safe until they reach sexual
Mhm,
maturity, which can be up to 10 years of age. And only then, if there's an opening, if an alpha female leaves or passes away, then there's an opening that you as a young female could step into. And if you don't
Mm.
have that, you just carry on your own and wait, and it could be up until you're 20 or 30 before you find a group that'll accept you as an alpha female. So generally, if you're a girl, it's bad to start, but then really good later, because you're the queen and you've got this army of males looking after you. But
Mhm.
you really choice genetics, I guess, because you've survived out there on your own, sometimes for decades. And then
Mhm.
within the group structure, the adult males, as they gain experience, they are useful in terms of feeding the chick, but the youngsters are pretty useless. They're learning, so they
Mhm.
mimic what the older birds are doing. They catch a few grasshoppers. They may bring them to the female or the chick, but generally they're not super useful. But their role is in territory defense. So although they're not quite uh, smart enough, I guess, to be providers for the female and her chick, they build the army size. So it's less likely that a smaller group next door might come and steal the female or your nest or take over your territory. So there's sort of varied roles within the group. But yeah, generally alpha pair, bunch of helpers, up to about group size of 10.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, almost like the kind of primate structure, I suppose, of like a larger group of birds with a complicated dynamic, and like that's it. Really interesting, really, really interesting. And like the learning from each other, everything seems like, yeah, I get now even more why you made that comparison earlier on, because that's
Yeah.
so interesting. Um, I guess then. Oh, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, none of that helps them from a conservation point of view. It just makes them more difficult to work with and more difficult to try and protect.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually when because obviously then if they're not reaching sexual maturity for about kind of 10 years minimum, and then you have like that wait then even to get them into a new group and like everything, that's a very kind of long generational kind of if there's an issue that wipes out kind of an older members of the group, that's a long time to wait for maybe a new structure or a more kind of like leadership kind of roles to emerge. I guess is it something that makes it awkward to to protect them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So it's another reason that we really push that everything that we're doing is as science based as possible, because the
Mm-hmm.
decisions we take today for the species, we actually only ever going to see the effects of that in 10 to 20 years' time. So,
Yeah.
if you're dealing with something that's fast breeding and, you can do your adaptive management every couple of years. But with ground hornbills, because they're so long lived and the decisions we make today and the tools that we implement, it's going to take that long before we see results. So it makes us even more determined to get our science right, because we have to live with these decisions, probably for the rest of my life.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really interesting, and I guess it moves us on, I suppose, to talk about some of those threats that they faced, and the decisions that have to be made about them. Like, if you, I guess, like as with all species and all of these kind of wildlife things, threats will overlap, and there'll be things that impact them all over the place. But if generally, I guess, what would you consider to be the big kind of threats to this species?
So I think in a South African context, there's two biggies. We're
Hmm.
losing nest trees. Ground hornbills can't build a nest; they need to have a hollow in a big tree, and because they're so large, the hollow itself has to be about 50 centimeters across. And so,
Hmm.
you're talking about a tree then that must have, must be, a good 2 meters across to enable it to form that hollow. And so we're losing those trees in the landscape for a number of reasons. People chopping down trees. With climate change, we're getting much more frequent floods and more violent storms and stronger winds. And so a lot of our big riparian trees are just getting, blotted during these big storms. Fires,
Hmm.
and also in areas where elephant populations aren't managed, the elephant impact itself is taking out a number of the nest trees. And so,
Hmm.
if you're territorial and you don't have a nest, but you can live until you're 70, they're quite happy to plod on for generations without breeding. And obviously, for an endangered species, that's something that we just can't allow to happen. So that's one issue. And then the other one is poisoning. There's still a lot of farmers who use poison for so-called pest species, jackal, hyena, leopard, feral dogs, and ground hornbills will scavenge. They're smart. A free meal. Who's going to turn
Mm-hmm.
down a free meal? And so what happens invariably then is a whole group will forage off a poison bait item. And so we don't just lose one or two individuals, we generally lose an entire breeding unit, which is all of the helpers and all of the territorial soldiers as such within the group. So that's, we're losing breeding units, and I think of them as sort of candles across a landscape, and we keep snuffing these candles out. And as you lose connectivity, the youngster, a young female dispersing from this group now doesn't just have to travel 10 to 20 to 30 kilometers to find a group. She now has to travel safely 2 to 300 kilometers to find another group where she may have a chance of being a breeder. So, it's sort of all those knock-on effects. It's, there's a complexity to it. But I think currently our biggest issue is lead poisoning. It's been known in Europe and the States for ages that if you're shooting lead ammunition, there's going to be tiny fragments left in the meat, especially the offal. And
Mm-hmm.
many people who do shoot, whether it's for hunting, whether it's for game management, reserve management purposes, anti-poaching, if something is shot, generally the offal is left in the field for scavengers, seen as a good thing. But it
Mm-hmm.
takes about a third of a grain of rice worth of lead to poison a ground hornbill. So, that's currently the biggest threat that we're fighting at the moment. Lead is a nasty, nasty neurotoxin. We still use it. We fish with them. We hunt with them. But it is, the more I research about lead, the more scared of lead I am, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's there's so many things there I want to ask about, because that is, it's such a range of threats, and I guess it brings in a whole lot of the issues that, and like even talking like the cultural significance before, then you can have to like to try and explain to people who maybe these birds are culturally significant, that the practices that they're doing are somehow unintentionally harming the birds, like in a way that it's kind of hard to explain, and maybe might be like an odd thing to kind of to have to do. It's really interesting, and there's so many other things, especially, so many questions have come to my brain. I'll organize them. I guess like if we go through each of them slightly, like just to kind of talk about, and maybe like what the kind of project that you run kind of does to kind of to start to contend with these things. I guess the first one that you mentioned was elephants, and kind of the kind of changing landscape and this sort of thing. And like I think changing landscape obviously kind of impacts all many species, and so it'd be interesting to hear your take, I guess, on how you start to deal with that, especially when it comes to, like, as you say, like maybe large charismatic animals that people love, and or kind of like these are does that like how do you begin to kind of contend with that issue of changing landscape?
All right. So before any elephant biologists get annoyed, I don't call it elephant damage. It's elephant impact. Elephants are just doing
Mhm.
what elephants are doing, and
Yeah.
so what we do is we're starting to try and use. Beehives to protect nest trees. That's been
Yeah.
proven to be quite effective for keeping elephants away from specific iconic trees. And thankfully, ground hornbill and vulture nests now sort of fall within that category of what might be considered an iconic tree that might need
Mhm.
protection. So there's that. But we also need elephants, because without elephants breaking those side branches, those hollows won't form with time. So, yes, it's a problem, but equally, the nests of the future aren't going to be formed without elephants around breaking those branches that allows the damage, that allows the rot and the fungus and everything to get in to form those hollows in the first place. So it's not a nasty finger pointing at Ellies, because we do need them. But it's just, in areas where elephant numbers aren't controlled, the
Yeah.
damage or the impact, sorry, is starting to mount up. But, there's ways of getting around it. And so we're doing our best with that.
Mhm. And that's really interesting, actually, because I'd heard the kind of the use of bees around maybe like crops and like to prevent kind of the human wildlife conflict, but I'd never heard the use of kind of like beehives and kind of bee nests, beehives. Bee, I don't think is bee nest a thing. I don't know. Beehives. The use of beehives to like, I suppose, create barriers, natural barriers between, I guess, spaces that two species, like, yeah, a barrier between two species other than humans and elephants, I suppose, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
really, really interesting, really, really interesting.
And
um
so,
and
there's only certain tree species that the elephants do impact. And so
yeah.
if we're putting up artificial nests, we just choose the species that aren't going to be impacted. So, it's protect the remaining wild nests in those few species that are at risk. But then obviously
Hmm.
if we're putting up artificial nests, don't choose the dodgy ones. Put it in something that an elephant isn't going to impact, and then it saves, it just makes the whole thing a lot more sustainable down the line.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's encouraging the birds into a nice, safe, good neighborhood for them that can, like, yeah, keep them happy, I suppose. Um,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, I guess the other thing that you mentioned, I guess, is the poison and lead, and I suppose those two. I mean, they come from a similar output, I suppose, in the feeding of the carcasses and kind of like things that have been left behind. But kind of, how do you begin to, I guess, contend with that sort of issue as well?
So we try and tackle it at two levels. Within South Africa, we now have a national wildlife poisoning prevention working group, and so
Hmm.
that is a multi-stakeholder group. So it's those of us who are concerned about what's happening for specific species. It's a number of government conservation departments, but also Department of Agriculture, Department of Mining, all of those guys who
Hmm.
are in some way or other putting things out into our environment that we could probably do without. So we formed this group with the intention that we bring it to the highest level, and so we're trying to tackle it from a policy level, but then also on the ground, just a straight education with the custodianship
Hmm.
program. Wherever there's a nest, we are then able to chat to that landowner, whether it's commercial. It could be a commercial timber plantation, a sugarcane farm, a cattle farm, or a communally managed grazing area. So
Hmm.
commercial or communal, it doesn't matter. We meet, we chat about the issues, and then we try and help solve. So if you are a agricultural concern, how do you store your poisons? Do you have a register? How do you dispose of old pesticides? So, a lot of it is just education and helping people just sort of firm up their protocols on site. And the intention then is that every breeding group, at least the property where its nest is safe from as many things as we can mitigate for.
Hmm. Hmm. That's, yeah, that's really interesting, actually, and it leads on to another question that I had, which is is about kind of this unique, almost unique problem, I suppose, with birds, and I guess people who work on this kind of species that live in the ocean will also have this issue in that, like, birds don't stay within a set. If you put up a fence or you put up a boundary or you put up something to kind of separate species from the threats that they face, a lot of the time that can work, I suppose. But with birds, there's that unique challenge of they can get over those fences and they can fly and they can do things and they can cross properties and they can move between things very, very easily. And I wondered, like, obviously that must present unique challenges, I suppose. Is that something that you've had to think about in terms of like working with birds, opposed to maybe some of your previous experiences that you mentioned when you were doing your kind of previous research and things?
Absolutely. I often compare these guys to the African wild dog.
Hmm.
They are group living, they're cooperative breeding, they generally drive human wildlife conflict, and they have the same disregard for fences. So, I think there's a lot of similarities between, what the wild dog guys are facing and what we're facing. And
Hmm.
a single territory for a ground hornbill family or group within South Africa is 100 square kilometers. So there could be
Yeah.
multiple land uses, landowners, good people, bad people, uneducated people, ignorant people. So, it's a real mishmash. And so we really try, certainly with the reintroductions that we do, we have at least a 20 to 30 kilometer buffer around the release site. And we try
Hmm.
and engage with everyone because, and we're not always going to win. But we do try and make sure that everyone knows about the birds, knows about the plight, knows what the major risks are. And obviously, we try and be as supportive as possible to mitigate for those risks and make it easier for landowners to make the right choices.
Hmm. Hmm. That's really really interesting, actually, really really interesting, because yeah, at the end of the day, yeah, that's the thing. At the end of the day, you can't go in and say, oh, if you see this bird, leave it alone. Like, we can work in conservation to the very best of our abilities to engage everyone and include everyone and provide the materials and things that people need. But yeah, that's it's good that you kind of try and reach as many people as possible within those impossibly difficultly big ranges.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I wondered, kind of, I feel like I feel we've kind of burned through a lot of the topics that I was gonna ask about, and I suppose, like, I did my research beforehand and found out kind of some of your projects to ask about. But was there any that maybe, like, we haven't talked about yet, that you were kind of like, oh, I'd like to mention this one, or there's something that we haven't covered yet to do with the project that you'd like to chat about?
I think the artificial nest that we're making.
Hmm.
So we've kind of got it right in that we've stepped away from using wooden nest boxes, which are fine and the birds love them and they breed in them, but they're unsustainable in the long run. So
Okay.
in ten years or so they rot, and then we've got to replace them. And we don't really want to be cutting down big trees to replace big trees with fake nests. So that whole context wasn't
Yeah.
really working for us. So we looked at alternative materials, and we went through a range of prototypes trying to test different materials, because we want the nest to be hornbill proof for a start, because they are quite apt to destroy anything you put out for them, but also to try and safeguard these birds from rising temperatures. What we are seeing in our savannas is certainly in the low veld and the Kruger National Park, quite a startling increase in our summer temperatures, to the point
Hmm.
that we think we're starting to see embryo death. There's only so hot it can be before eggs, incubating eggs start to really struggle with the heat. A female can heat an egg, but she can't cool an egg. And
Hmm.
so we've been testing a number of these prototypes, and although they're working now, we're not comfortable that they're good enough for 5 or 10 years from now. So we're working with
Hmm.
a number of different institutions and stakeholders to figure out how do we make a perfect ground hornbill nest in terms of it's hornbill proof, it's cheap to make, it's safe to make, so there's no materials that are going to harm the birds. We keep predators
Hmm.
out. We're not creating a micro environment for feather lice and all sorts of other nasties, but also that we are going to somehow protect those eggs a decade from now from these increasingly long and hot heat waves that we're getting during the summer, which is the breeding season. So I guess one of our biggest challenges at the moment is how do we keep them breeding in the face of these rising temperatures.
Hmm. Hmm. And that's really interesting. And I guess, like, yeah, it's good that it's good that you are, I suppose, preempting the issue in that you're creating this almost sustainable kind of, not sustain, but kind of the model where, like, you won't have to replace these things, and looking forward and forecasting for the future of the things that the animals will need, aside from just kind of dealing with the issues that perhaps are kind of the big issue right now, looking forward. And I suppose it goes back to the thing that we were talking about right at the very beginning, where it is kind of this long generational long game with this animal, where it's the generations are longer, and it is going to take 10 years and for various things, and 20 years for various things to be noticed. So playing the long game and kind of thinking about what are the issues going to be down the line is really really interesting, and I guess a really important, clever way of allocating your funds and time so that you're kind of ahead of the
Yeah.
curve almost. Hmm.
Trying, definitely it's
Yes.
something we're working towards. And I do need to give a shout out also to our sponsors who've been with us for the long game, who recognize
Hmm.
that with a species like this, we can't show results in a year or 2 years.
Yeah.
We need this long term commitment in terms of support. And we do have some of those sponsors. And we're just so incredibly grateful that they've given us the safety and the stability to build this project, to grow on what we're
Hmm.
doing, and kind of looking at it in the same sort of time frames as a ground hornbill lifespan.
Hmm. Hmm. That's fantastic, actually, because yeah, you tend, a lot of funding and things for various projects and research projects can be very tied to results, and kind of like, we need this number now, which, so it's good that you've managed to find collaborators that, yeah, that are able to kind of stretch that and have faith that, yes, these people know what they're doing, we can support the project in the long term. That's really, really interesting. Um,
Yeah.
I guess like before we wrap up, then I guess one final question is kind of to do with just to kind of bring the ground hornbill chat to an end before we get onto kind of my standard kind of advice type questions for listeners. Is that what is something that I guess you're look at if you were to look forward to the future with the kind of organization and things that you're doing, what are the things that make you excited and hopeful to keep going and keep working on the projects that you're working on?
Um, I think we as a team are completely filled with hope because a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
conservation tools that we've developed slowly over the years, and it's been some hard lessons along the way, but I feel what we have learned is working now. And so we have
Mm-hmm.
tried and tested tools, and it's really just for us a scale of we need to just upscale. So we just need
Mm-hmm.
to be able to grow our team, grow our sponsorship, and we know it works. We've proven that it works. So it's
Mm-hmm.
been well tested, and not just for the Southern Ground Hornbill. We're starting to work with the Northern or Abyssinian Ground Hornbill as well now. So we've got 2 students in Ghana, we've got a postdoc in Senegal, because there's nothing known about the Northern Ground Hornbill. It's ridiculous that we've got such an enormous bird, so culturally important,
Mm-hmm.
so obviously visible on the landscape, but not a single scientific paper published about them. Lots published about the cultural aspects, which I think is fascinating, but it doesn't help us to be able to put together a conservation plan across
Mm-hmm.
multiple range states for that species. And the more we learn, the more we see we can take a lot of the lessons we've learned for ours, and we're going to be able to apply them. So we're going to be able to kickstart the conservation for the sort of sister or cousin species of the Southern Ground Hornbill. So, I think it's exciting that we do know what we're doing. We just have to be able to upscale it, but not just for ours. It's scalable to another species. So that's ground hornbills covered. It's just a case of doing it, getting out there and doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really yeah that's really fascinating actually, and I guess yes in a few years time once you've got the ball rolling on that, I and that gives me an excuse to have another episode all about the kind of northern ground hornbill the
Yeah.
and we can come back and chat I guess about some of the differences and things that you have discovered potentially, or
Well,
the things that the different complications.
one of the most
Mhm.
alarming things we found in one of our study sites is not a single juvenile. So it looks like an entirely adult population. And we think that's because the big trees were taken out 30, 40 years ago before this area was made a national park.
Oh wow.
And, that has massive ramifications. So, yeah, there's a lot of
Mhm.
work to be done. But, there's good people on it. And, yeah, I do think we'll be able to, to do something positive. Whether it'll be enough in time, for the Northerns, I don't know because we're starting so late in the game, but certainly for
Mhm.
the Southerns, I have huge faith that we'll be able to turn things around for them.
Mhm. Mhm. That's yes. That's I guess yes. A nice hopeful message on one part, but also provides us, I guess, with something to think about going forward, and come away from the episode thinking about of kind of this, yeah, how we prioritize and how we can work with various very similar species. I suppose something to think about. I guess like with that in mind and kind of moving on to kind of wrap up and bring the episode to a close, every kind of week this series I've been asking the same kind of three or two or three kind of quick fire ish questions of kind of like my guests, because this series has been a celebration of Africa and all of the biodiversity and kind of wonderful species that you find across the continent. And of course, we can have some episodes that are dedicated to things like the ground hornbill and hyenas and okapi and things. But to cover as much of the breadth of diversity as we can, I always like to ask the guests, is there any species that, aside from the hornbill that we've been talking about today, um, that you'd like to highlight, that you'd like to shine the spotlight on, something that doesn't get talked about enough, something that kind of the listeners should maybe go and look up or learn more about? Like what would that species be for you?
Hmm. I've been so
It's a
hornbill
tricky one.
focused for so long. I haven't had a chance to look outside and see what else. I mean, certainly in Southern Africa, our pangolins are being absolutely hard hit, and they're
Mhm.
not rhinos, they're not elephants. They need all the support and interest that we can get. Um, Is it allowed to not be a species? Well, okay, let me pick a
Yeah,
species.
you
I
go for.
think I'm gonna pick a tree species. I think our baobabs are in trouble. I
Okay.
think for a number of reasons.
Hmm.
I think warming climate, elephant impact, and each baobab tree in itself is an ecosystem. And I worry that
Hmm.
Madagascar's already lost a lot of their dispersers for their baobab species, and they sort of, living but extinct at the same time. And I worry
Hmm.
that our baobab trees are starting to see similar trends. So, it's not an animal, but it's such a vitally important part of the African savannas in terms of providing a water source, a shelter, nesting, fruit, pollen, all sorts of things.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'd pick the baobab.
No, that's a fantastic choice because I feel like only one other person this series has named a plant species. Even though anybody could have taken it that way, we've had one person mention orchids. So
Okay.
you've joined a very exclusive group that I think is actually it's a good one. And yeah, it's an iconic, interesting tree that I feel like it's good to bring to people's attention that sometimes I feel like people there is this like plant blindness of people walk past things and they look at pictures of a savanna or an ecosystem and they see all of the kind of elephants and giraffes and all these big species and they look past the grasses and they look past the trees and they look past everything else. So I appreciate the refocusing on the plant life. I'm glad you brought it up. Really glad
Okay.
you brought it up
All
actually.
right.
Um,
Nailed question one. Next.
Yes, and the the second question, which I'm sure equally brilliant answer is to come, is if you could give if listeners out there are kind of inspired by anything you've said or want to take action to kind of help or do something for the environment or conservation. It's a big question, and you could take it in a million different directions. But what advice would you give to people who do want to be more involved in conservation?
I think if you're based on the African continent, uh,
Hmm.
get involved in citizen science. There's a growing surge of citizen scientists across the continent, but we definitely need more. It's very,
Hmm.
very valuable information data that comes in from that. So once you start looking for those underloved, underseen species, find ways to report on them, find who's working on them, and get all of your sightings. It may seem silly to just drive past and be like, oh, there's three in a field over there, but that might be the first sighting of that species in that province. It may be the sign of a population moving because of climate change. So, every time you observe something like that, it's super important. And I would say get involved with citizen science.
Hmm. Hmm. I think it's how every people noticing things changing is how things get how and bringing them up is how the research and it's important that people do notice these things and yeah I think it goes beyond even if you're on the African continent, yes, get
Yeah.
involved, but also if you're listening to this sat in the UK or the US or somewhere across Asia or Europe at large, anywhere you are, there is bound to be a project out there, a local conservation project that is looking for people to help document birds or document kind of amphibians or insect populations or whatever it is. There's bound to be something out there. So yeah, another a fantastic. I don't think someone's mentioned that this series, so that's another fantastic recommendation. And yeah, something even if you don't citizen science sounds scary, but you don't have to be a trained scientist. That's the whole point. You can be anybody who's noticing these things, and no matter your level of training or expertise, you can usually find a way to get involved with it, which is good. Um,
Absolutely. And I mean, everyone has, well, not everyone, but most people now have a smartphone. So you have a
mhm,
camera in your hand, you have a GPS, all the traditional tools you would have had as a biologist, you would have saved as a biologist, 20, 30 years ago to get the right equipment. You've got it in your
mhm,
hand now. And really cool apps, things like iNaturalist or eBirds,
yeah.
even if you don't know what you're looking at, take a photo and someone within a forum will be like, oh, wow, that's a super rare butterfly that hasn't been seen for 60 years. So even if you don't know what you're looking at, someone will, and
Mhm,
someone will recognize the importance of what you're seeing. And it makes you look more. I've certainly found it makes me look at the little things more.
mhm, mhm. And yes, that's I think that's the perfect way to start wrapping up this episode because the whole show is about looking at and appreciating the little things. So if we can make people do that, that's the goal achieved. Tick, we're done. That's perfect. No, that's fantastic, and I think yeah, brilliant. really interesting, brilliant information throughout the whole thing. It's got me thinking about a whole lot of stuff that I need to go away and look up and do more research into and find out more about. And I'm sure the listeners will have loved hearing all about everything that you do. So I guess, like, last question for you before I say all my thanks to you and everything is, of course, where, if they do want to keep up to date and learn more about your work specifically and kind of the project and everything that you do, like, where can they go? What can they follow? Is there a website? Where should they go to learn more?
Sure. So our website is www.ground-hornbill.org.za. So groundhornbill.org.za. It's a little outdated, but we're in the process of refreshing that. For immediately up-to-date things, please hit us up on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just look us up, Mabula Ground Hornbill Project. And yeah, drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you.
Perfect, perfect. And I'll put the links to everything that you've mentioned throughout the episode and everything you mentioned there in the description of this episode. So if anyone is interested, all of the handles for Twitter and Instagram and all of these various places and the website will all be in the description of the episode. And when you're down there, of course, you can also find all of the descriptions for our social media. So go and follow both of us while you're there to keep up to date with everything that's going on. I'll be posting all sorts of photos and things throughout the week. So if you're still wondering what a ground hornbill looks like and you haven't looked it up yet, I'll be posting photos, and I'm sure they're fabulous photos on your social media as well, Lucy, of all of these things. So yes, go and make sure and follow all of that sort of stuff. And yeah, I guess subscribe to the podcast while you're here. Leave us a nice review, do all that classic sort of things as well. And I guess then that kind of, with all of that said and all of that kind of done, that brings us to the end. I feel like this hour has flown by. I've had so much fun talking to you. I feel like I've learned so much, Lucy. Thank you so much for your time. It's been so fascinating, and I had a love for the ground hornbill coming into this, and I feel like it's only, my interest has only increased exponentially throughout this whole conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Good, I'm glad. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for giving the little ugly things a voice. It's really cool.
Beautiful things, beautiful, pretty things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh,
Cool.
well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for listening. And until next time, goodbye, everyone.